Elena Marchetti heard the lock on the front door click into place before she had even reached the hallway, and she knew, the way a person knows a storm has already arrived, that tonight would not end like every other night had ended. She did not stop to think. She grabbed her coat from the back of a kitchen chair and slipped out through the side door that led to the garden, the one Daniel always forgot to check because he believed she was too afraid to use it. The night air hit her like cold water. Rain had started somewhere in the last hour, and it had not asked anyone's permission. Her shoes were not made for running. She ran anyway. Behind her, a light came on in the bedroom window. She did not look back to see if he was watching. She had learned, over 6 years of marriage, that looking back only slowed her down, and slowing down was something she could no longer afford. The street outside her house in Lower Hartfield was empty at this hour, lined with quiet houses and parked cars that all seemed to be holding their breath. Elena's phone was dead. Her purse had been left behind on the kitchen counter, along with most of her courage. All she carried was a small bag she had packed weeks ago and hidden behind the water heater, the one she had never had the nerve to use until tonight. She thought of her sister first, but Daniel knew her sister's address by heart, and that was the first place he would look. She thought of a hotel, but hotels asked for cards, and cards could be traced. She thought, finally, of a name she had only ever heard whispered in the back rooms of restaurants, and in nervous jokes among neighbors who never explained the joke further. Vittorio Conte. Everyone in this part of the city knew the name, and almost no one said it out loud in front of strangers. He ran the old social club on Belmore Street, a place with blacked-out windows and a single brass plaque that gave nothing away. People said he settled disputes that the police never heard about. People said men who crossed him disappeared quietly, without ceremony. People said a great many things, and Elena had never believed most of them. Tonight, belief did not matter. She needed a door that Daniel would never think to knock on. She ran 3 blocks before her lungs began to burn, then 4 more before the rain turned from light to relentless. Twice, she thought she heard a car slow down behind her, and both times her heart climbed into her throat before the car passed without stopping. By the time Belmore Street came into view, her hands were shaking too hard to feel the cold anymore. The club's front door was a heavy slab of dark wood with no handle on the outside, only a small brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. Elena stood in front of it for exactly 3 seconds, rain running down the back of her collar, before she lifted her fist and brought it down hard, 3 times, the way people knock when they have stopped caring how it looks. Nothing happened. She knocked again, harder. A bolt slid somewhere behind the wood, and the door opened just wide enough to show a man with broad shoulders and a face that had clearly stopped strangers at this door many times before. He looked at her for a long moment, taking in the soaked hair, the bare feet pushed into wet shoes, the bag clutched against her chest like something precious. "Club's closed," he said. "Please," Elena said. Her voice cracked on the single word, and she hated how small it sounded. "I need to speak to Mr. Conte. Please. I have nowhere else to go." The man's eyes moved past her, scanning the street behind her out of habit rather than suspicion. Whatever he saw, or did not see, made him step back from the door instead of closing it. "Wait here," he said, and disappeared into the dark hallway behind him. Elena stood on the doorstep, shivering, counting her own heartbeats to keep herself from running again. The street stayed empty. No headlights, no footsteps. Just rain falling steadily onto a city that did not care one way or another whether she made it through the night. When the door opened again, it was wider, and the man standing in the frame was not the one who had answered before. Vittorio Conte was not what she had expected. She had pictured something closer to the men in films, heavy gold rings and a voice like gravel. Instead, the man in front of her was tall and lean, dressed simply in a dark sweater, with quiet gray eyes that studied her, without any of the menace his reputation had promised. He looked, more than anything, like a man who had been interrupted in the middle of reading something important. "You're soaked through," he said. It was not a question, and it was not an invitation either, not yet. "I'm sorry to come here like this," Elena said. "I didn't know where else to go. My husband, the word caught somewhere behind her teeth, and she could not finish it standing on a doorstep in front of a stranger, even one she had walked 4 miles in the rain to find. Something shifted in Vittorio's expression. It was small, almost nothing, but Elena would remember it later, as the moment the night changed direction. He stepped back from the door and held it open. "Come inside before you catch your death," he said. "We'll talk where it's dry." The hallway smelled of old wood polish and coffee that had been made hours ago and never poured out. Elena followed him past a closed set of double doors, behind which she could hear low voices and the soft click of dominoes on a table, and up a narrow staircase that led to a private office on the second floor. The room was simple: a desk, 2 chairs, a window with the blinds drawn tight against the street below. Vittorio gestured for her to sit, and when she hesitated, he poured a small glass of something amber and set it in front of her, instead of pressing the chair on her. "Drink that. It'll stop the shaking faster than I can," he said. Elena wrapped both hands around the glass without drinking from it. The warmth alone was enough for now. "You don't know me," she said. "I know you knocked on a door most people in this city are afraid to even walk past," Vittorio said, leaning against the edge of the desk. "That tells me something. Tell me the rest." So she told him. Not everything, not yet, because some things still felt too dangerous to say out loud, even in a locked room. But she told him about a marriage that had started with flowers and ended with a man who controlled which doors in their house stayed locked and which stayed open. A man whose temper she had learned to read in his footsteps before he ever reached the kitchen. She told him she had reported it once, 2 years ago, and that the report had vanished into a system that seemed designed to lose such things. She told him that tonight, for the first time, she had truly believed that if she stayed in that house 1 more hour, she might not get another chance to leave it. Vittorio listened without interrupting. When she finished, the room was quiet except for the rain against the window. "And you came here," he said, "because you thought I was the one man in this city your husband would be too frightened to knock on." "I didn't know who else might be brave enough to say no to him," Elena admitted. A faint, humorless smile crossed Vittorio's face. "People say a lot of things about this club. Most of it isn't true. Some of it is." He studied her for a long moment, the way a man studies a problem he has not yet decided whether to take on. "What I can tell you is this. Nobody touches anyone under this roof without going through me first. That includes husbands who think locked doors are something other people don't get to use." Elena felt something in her chest loosen, just slightly, for the first time in hours. "Does that mean I can stay?" "It means tonight you sleep somewhere dry, and tomorrow we talk about what staying actually looks like," Vittorio said. "This isn't a hotel, Mrs. Voss. There are rules here, and you'll need to follow every one of them if you want to be safe." "I'll follow whatever rules you want," Elena said quickly. "I just need somewhere he won't think to look." Vittorio walked to the window and lifted one slat of the blind, glancing down at the empty street below, as if he expected to see headlights even now. He let the slat fall back into place. "There's an apartment above the kitchen, in the back of the building," he said. "Small, quiet. Nobody outside this club knows it exists. You'll stay there, you'll keep the curtains drawn, and you won't go near the front windows or the front door. Not for any reason. Is that understood?" Elena nodded, too relieved to manage actual words. "Good," Vittorio said, "because the moment you walk out that door without me knowing, you're not just risking yourself. You're risking every person inside this building who agreed to look the other way tonight." The weight of that settled over her slowly, the understanding that she had just stepped from one kind of danger into a different one, smaller perhaps, but no less real. Still, when the man from the front door appeared again to lead her upstairs, Elena followed without hesitation, because for the first time in longer than she could remember, the fear walking beside her belonged to someone else's house, not her own. Outside, the rain continued to fall over Belmore Street, washing her wet footprints from the pavement before anyone could follow them home. Somewhere across the city, in a kitchen that had gone cold and silent, Daniel Voss stood holding a phone in one hand and an empty water glass in the other, staring at the side door that should have been locked and was not. He did not call the police that night. He did not call her sister either. Instead, he stood very still for a long time, thinking, the way a careful man thinks when something he believed belonged to him has gone missing without permission. By morning, he had already begun making calls of his own. The first call went not to a private investigator but to the local police station, where Daniel reported, in a voice carefully measured to sound frightened rather than calculating, that his wife had vanished sometime in the night, without her phone, her purse, or any word of where she might have gone. 2 officers arrived within the hour, and Daniel met them at the door in clothes that looked as though he had not changed since the night before, though in truth he had chosen them with care. He led the officers through the house slowly, pointing out the things a worried husband would point out, an unfinished cup of tea on the counter, the side door left unlocked, a small bottle of medication he claimed she sometimes forgot to take, though no doctor had ever actually prescribed it to her. He spoke of her in the gentle, sorrowful tone of a man describing a wife he feared was unwell, rather than one he had spent years quietly controlling. And the officers, having no reason yet to doubt him, wrote down everything he said exactly as he said it. Any family she might have gone to? The older officer asked, pen ready. Her sister, possibly, Daniel said, supplying the address without hesitation, already certain it would lead nowhere useful, and confident that offering it freely would make him look like exactly the cooperative, concerned husband he was performing. Beyond that, I honestly don't know. She hasn't been herself lately. I should have insisted she see someone sooner. By the time the officers left, a missing persons report had been filed, a description circulated, and Daniel Voss had successfully transformed himself, in the eyes of anyone who might later ask questions, into the patient, suffering spouse of a woman whose disappearance was a tragedy rather than an escape. He closed the door behind the departing officers, exhaled slowly, and allowed himself, for the first time since the night before, something close to a smile. Elena did not know any of this yet. In the small apartment above the kitchen, behind curtains drawn tight against a window she had been told never to approach, she slept for the first time in months without listening for footsteps on the stairs. The city moved on below her, indifferent and unaware, while two very different searches quietly began. One was for a way to disappear completely. The other was for a way to make sure she never could. Neither Elena nor Vittorio understood yet how far either search would eventually have to go. The first morning in the apartment above the kitchen began with a silence so complete that Elena lay still for several minutes simply listening to it, half convinced she had imagined the night before. There was no creak of floorboards from a room down the hall, no low voice testing the air before deciding whether the day would be calm or otherwise. There was only the distant clatter of pans from the kitchen below and, somewhere further off, a radio playing music too faint to recognize. She rose slowly, careful out of habit rather than necessity, and found the small bathroom attached to the apartment stocked with towels that smelled of nothing in particular, a soap dish, and a folded set of clothes left neatly on the counter that were close enough to her size to suggest someone had guessed well rather than known for certain. She dressed without questioning it. In a place built on rules she did not yet understand, it seemed wisest not to ask too many questions before breakfast. Downstairs, the kitchen was already busy with the quiet rhythm of a business getting ready for its day, men and women moving past each other, with the practiced ease of people who had worked together for years. A young woman with flour on her sleeves looked up when Elena appeared in the doorway, offered a small smile that asked no questions, and pointed toward a stool at the end of the counter. "Sit," she said. "Coffee's behind you. Mr. Conte said to feed you before anyone bothers you with anything else." Elena sat. The coffee was strong and a little too hot, and she drank it anyway, grateful for something ordinary to hold on to. Around her, the kitchen carried on as though a stranger appearing overnight in the apartment above it was nothing unusual at all, which told Elena more about this place than any explanation could have. It was Sal Romano who found her there 20 minutes later, leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed, and an expression that made it clear he had not yet decided what to make of her. He was the same broad-shouldered man who had answered the front door the night before, and in daylight, he looked even less inclined toward patience. "You're the one from last night," he said, though it was not really a question. "Elena," she offered. "I know who you are." Sal's eyes moved over her once, assessing rather than unkind. "What I don't know is why Mr. Conte decided a stranger off the street gets a room in this building when half the men who've worked here for years still sleep somewhere else." "I didn't ask him to do anything," Elena said carefully. "I asked for somewhere to be safe for a night. He decided the rest." "That's exactly my problem with it," Sal said. He did not raise his voice, but something in his tone made the kitchen around them grow quieter, the way a room does when people are listening without appearing to. "This club survives because everyone in it understands the rules. Nobody outside the family knows what happens behind these walls. Now we've got a woman nobody's vetted sleeping 2 floors above where business gets done." Elena set her coffee cup down carefully, aware that her hands had begun to shake again, though not from the cold this time. "I'm not here to learn your business, Mr. Romano. I'm here because I didn't have anywhere else to go that my husband wouldn't think to check." "Your husband?" Sal said the word the way a man tests ice before deciding whether it will hold his weight. And who exactly is your husband? Daniel Voss, Elena said. Something flickered behind Sal's eyes, brief and unreadable, gone before Elena could decide what it meant. He said nothing further, only gave a short nod, and walked back the way he had come, leaving Elena alone, with a cooling cup of coffee, and the uncomfortable sense that she had just become a problem someone else would need to manage. She did not see Vittorio again until early evening. When he finally appeared at the top of the back stairs, he carried with him a folded newspaper and an expression that gave nothing away. "You're settling in," he said, glancing around the small apartment, as though checking it had not changed since the night before. "Your staff have been kind," Elena said. Sal seems less convinced. A faint, almost amused look crossed Vittorio's face. Sal worries about everything. It's his job. He worried about the new coffee supplier for 2 weeks before he decided the beans weren't poisoned. He set the newspaper down on the small table by the window, folded so that only the bottom half showed. "I want to be honest with you about something, since honesty seems to be in short supply in your life lately." Elena's stomach tightened. "Go on." "Your husband reported you missing this morning. Police were at your house by 9. Vittorio watched her carefully as he said it, the way a doctor watches a patient's reaction to bad news. Concerned husband, worried wife, the whole performance. From what I hear, he played it well. Elena felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, though she had not moved. "What does that mean, for me, I mean? Could they make me go back?" "Not if you don't want to," Vittorio said. "You're an adult. You're allowed to leave your own house. But it means people are looking for you now, officially, and that complicates things." He paused, weighing his next words. "It also means I need to know everything about this man, Elena. Not the parts that are comfortable to say. All of it. If I'm going to keep you safe inside these walls, I can't be surprised by what's coming for you from outside them." So she told him more, that evening, sitting across the small table while the light outside faded from gray to black. She told him about the early years, when Daniel's attention had felt like devotion rather than ownership, and how slowly, almost too slowly to notice, devotion had curdled into something else entirely. She told him about the friends she had stopped seeing because Daniel found reasons to dislike each one in turn, about the job she had given up because he said her hours worried him, about the small, careful negotiations that had come to define every hour of her day. She did not tell him everything. Some rooms in a marriage stayed locked even when the marriage itself had ended. Vittorio listened the way he had the night before, without interrupting, his expression unreadable except for the occasional tightening around his jaw that suggested some of what she said had landed harder than he let show. "He'll keep looking," Vittorio said finally. "Men like that don't let go because a wife walked out the door. They let go when something costs them more than they're willing to pay to keep looking." "What does that mean?" Elena asked. "It means I have some thinking to do," Vittorio said, and would not say more that night. Over the following days, Elena began to learn the shape of her new world, narrow as it was. She learned which floorboard near the window creaked and avoided it without being told twice. She learned the names of the kitchen staff, a quiet woman named Grace Bennett who ran the books for the club's legitimate side, a teenage boy named Marco, who Vittorio treated less like an employee and more like a nephew he was determined to keep out of trouble. She learned that the club downstairs operated, on its surface, as nothing more than a private social hall where men played cards and drank coffee that never seemed to run out, and that whatever business truly moved through its back rooms stayed carefully separated from the rest of the building by doors that were always, without exception, kept closed to her. She learned, too, the particular quiet of evenings when Vittorio climbed the back stairs after the club had closed below, sometimes with a newspaper, sometimes with nothing but tired eyes and a willingness to sit across from her for 20 minutes before retreating to whatever life waited for him elsewhere in the building. Those 20 minutes became, without either of them naming it as such, the steadiest part of her day. "You don't have to check on me every night," she told him, on the 4th evening, when he appeared at her door with 2 cups of tea instead of 1. "I'm not checking on you," Vittorio said, setting 1 cup in front of her. "I'm making sure the one person in this building who didn't choose this life isn't losing her mind from boredom. There's a difference." Elena allowed herself a small laugh, the first since she had arrived. "Is there?" "Barely," Vittorio admitted, and for a moment the careful distance between them softened into something that felt, almost dangerously, like friendship. It was on the 5th day that the official search came close enough to test the club's defenses for the first time. 2 officers, the same pair who had taken Daniel's report a week earlier, were canvassing the wider neighborhood with a photograph of Elena, following a tip that had led, after several wrong turns, to a street several blocks from where she actually was. They had no particular reason to suspect Belmore Street, only a general instruction to ask shopkeepers and residents if anyone resembling the woman in the photograph had been seen. When the officers knocked at the club's front door, it was Sal who answered, his manner so easy and unbothered that Elena, watching from the narrow gap of the upstairs apartment door where she had been told to wait, found herself almost as unsettled by his calm as she would have been by panic. "Haven't seen her," Sal told the officers, glancing at the photograph with the mild, unhurried interest of a man being asked about a stranger. "We get a lot of faces through here during the day. Nothing that stands out, though. Sorry I can't help more." The older officer thanked him and moved on to the next storefront, and that was the end of it as far as the police were concerned. One unremarkable door among dozens canvassed that afternoon, nothing about it memorable enough to warrant a second visit. Upstairs, Elena let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, her hand pressed flat against the wall beside the door, as though she could steady the whole building through touch alone. "They were so close," she said, when Vittorio came to check on her a few minutes later. "Right there, at the front door." "And they left," Vittorio said simply. "That's the part that matters. Sal's handled worse than 2 officers with a photograph. The trick isn't hiding so well that nobody ever comes close, Elena. It's making sure that when they do, there's nothing here for them to find." It was, Elena understood slowly over the following days, a kind of safety built less on invisibility than on careful, practiced calm. The same steady, unbothered confidence Sal had shown at the door repeated in 100 smaller ways throughout the building, in how deliveries were handled, in how conversations among staff never lingered too long on any one subject, in how the club's surface life continued exactly as it always had, giving nothing away to anyone who came looking. It was on the 6th day that the quiet nearly broke in a different way entirely. Elena had grown careless, not through any fault of her own, but through the slow erosion that comes from days spent in the same small rooms. A delivery had arrived at the back entrance, ordinary crates of vegetables and bread, and in the bustle of unloading them, Elena had drifted to the edge of the kitchen doorway to watch, drawn by nothing more than the simple human need to see something happening in the world beyond her 4 walls. She did not notice the man who had come with the delivery truck lingering a half-second too long near the doorway, his eyes catching on her face before she stepped back into the shadow of the hallway. She did not notice, because she had no reason yet to know that Daniel had begun paying for information from anyone willing to sell it, including men who drove delivery routes through neighborhoods where certain clubs kept certain secrets. Sal noticed instead. He always noticed. Within the hour, Elena found herself standing in Vittorio's office for the 2nd time since her arrival, this time with Sal pacing near the window and Vittorio sitting very still behind his desk, his fingers steepled in front of him in a way Elena had not seen before. "She was seen," Sal said, before Elena had even fully closed the door behind her, "not by anyone connected to your husband directly, as far as I can tell, but seen by a stranger. That's already one too many." "It was a delivery man," Elena said. "He glanced at me for a second, that's all. That's how it always starts," Sal said. "A second here, a second there, then someone mentions it to someone else over a drink, and 3 weeks from now we've got a problem standing on our doorstep that didn't need to exist." Vittorio raised a hand, and Sal fell silent, though his jaw remained tight with the kind of frustration that came from caring too much rather than too little. "He's not wrong," Vittorio said, looking at Elena with none of the gentleness she had grown used to over their evening conversations. "From this point forward, you don't come near the kitchen doorway during deliveries. You don't come near any window that faces the street, day or night, under any circumstance. If you need air, you take it on the back landing, where the wall blocks the view from the alley. Are we clear?" "We're clear," Elena said quietly, the warmth of the past few days replaced by a sharper, colder understanding of exactly how precarious her safety actually was. After Sal left, Vittorio remained behind, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I'm sorry," Elena said finally. "I wasn't thinking." "You weren't thinking like someone in hiding," Vittorio said, his voice gentler now that they were alone. "That's not a flaw, Elena. It means you haven't fully accepted yet that this is your life right now, But you need to accept it, because the man looking for you isn't going to stop looking, just because a week has passed quietly. He was right to worry. Across the city, in an office with the blinds drawn and a desk covered in printouts that had nothing to do with his actual job, Daniel Voss sat reviewing a list of names given to him by a man he had paid well for the privilege. Most of the names led nowhere. One delivery route, however, ran consistently through a stretch of Belmore Street that Daniel had never previously had reason to think about. He circled it twice in red ink, then sat back in his chair with the particular stillness of a man who has just felt the ground shift slightly beneath a problem he had begun to believe was unsolvable. It was not proof. It was barely even a clue. But Daniel Voss had built his career on turning small, unremarkable details into certainties, and he was not a man who let a thread go unpulled once he had found one. He picked up his phone and made the first of several calls that would, over the following days, begin drawing an invisible line from his quiet, careful office directly toward the back door of a building neither he nor Elena had ever imagined would matter so much to either of their lives. Elena, sealed safely behind drawn curtains 2 floors above a kitchen full of strangers who had become, against every expectation, something close to allies, had no way of knowing that the second search had just gained its first real foothold. She only knew that for the first time since arriving, the apartment above the kitchen felt less like a refuge and more like a room with a clock ticking somewhere she could not quite hear. That night she lay awake long after the building below had gone quiet, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a place she was beginning, slowly and against her better judgment, to think of as something like home. She did not yet know how soon she would have to fight to keep it. The man Daniel called that night was someone he had used before, a private investigator named Edward Cole who advertised himself as a specialist in family matters, and worked, in practice, for whichever side of a family matter paid him first. Edward had a particular talent for finding people who did not wish to be found, and an even greater talent for not asking too many questions about why his clients wanted them found in the first place. "I need you to look into a delivery route," Daniel told him over the phone, his voice carrying the calm, reasonable tone he used for everything, even threats. "Belmore Street and the surrounding blocks. I want to know every business that receives regular deliveries, who owns them, and who comes and goes." "That's a lot of ground for not much reason," Edward said. "You want to tell me what I'm actually looking for?" "My wife," Daniel said simply. "She's not well, Edward. She left in the middle of the night without her medication, and I'm worried about what might happen to her out there alone. I just want to know she's safe." It was, Edward Cole would later admit to himself, a very convincing performance. He took the job. Over the following 2 days, Edward worked his way through Belmore Street, with the patient thoroughness of a man who understood that most secrets were not hidden so much as simply unasked about. He spoke to shop owners, to a woman who ran a flower stand on the corner, to the same delivery driver who had glanced too long at a doorway 6 days earlier. Most conversations led nowhere. The delivery driver, however, mentioned almost in passing that the old social club on the corner kept strange hours for a place that supposedly only served coffee and card games, and that he thought he'd seen a woman matching the description Edward carried, just for a second, in a kitchen doorway that should have been empty. Edward wrote the address down and underlined it twice. Inside the club, life continued in its careful, narrow rhythm, unaware that the invisible line connecting Daniel's office to their back door had just grown a little shorter. Elena had begun, despite herself, to find a kind of peace in the routine Vittorio's rules had built around her. Mornings in the kitchen with Grace, who taught her how to balance the club's modest legitimate accounts as something to occupy her hands and mind. Afternoons on the back landing, the one place she was permitted fresh air, where Marco sometimes joined her to complain cheerfully about schoolwork he was supposed to be doing instead. Evenings with Vittorio, 20 minutes that had quietly stretched to 30, then to whole hours where conversation wandered from careful subjects into honest ones. On the back landing, Elena had also begun, almost without meaning to, tending a row of herbs in a chipped wooden box Marco had found discarded behind a hardware store and dragged upstairs without being asked. Basil first, then a stubborn little mint plant that refused to stay within its half of the box. Then, eventually, a few tomato seedlings Grace assured her would never survive the limited sun but that Elena tended anyway, out of nothing more than the simple, steadying pleasure of watching something small grow under her own careful attention, after years of watching everything around her shrink instead. It became, without either of them ever naming it as such, the one part of each day that belonged entirely to her. It was during one of these evenings, nearly 2 weeks into her stay, that Elena finally asked the question she had been holding back since the night she arrived. "Why did you let me stay?" she asked. "That first night, you didn't know me. You had every reason to close the door." Vittorio considered the question longer than she expected before answering. "My mother left a man very much like your husband when I was young enough to remember it clearly, but too young to do anything about it," he said. "She knocked on a door much like the one you knocked on. The man who answered turned her away because he didn't want the trouble." He paused. "I decided a long time ago that if I were ever the man behind that door, I would not make her choice for her." The honesty in his voice caught Elena off guard, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them carrying more weight than either had intended. "I'm grateful," Elena said finally, "in case I haven't said it enough." "You've said it plenty," Vittorio said, the warmth returning to his expression. "Just stay safe enough that you don't have to keep saying it." Not everyone connected to Belmore Street greeted Elena's presence with the same quiet acceptance the kitchen staff had shown from the first morning. Vittorio's older sister, Nora Conte, ran a small but well-respected restaurant 2 streets over, a business entirely separate from the club but bound to it by blood and decades of shared history, and she did not learn of Elena's presence until nearly 3 weeks after the fact, a delay her brother had clearly arranged on purpose. "You hid this from me," Nora said, the first time she confronted him about it, standing in his office with her arms crossed in a posture Elena would later recognize as nearly identical to Sal's. "A married woman, running from a husband who's already involved the police, living above our kitchen, and you didn't think that was worth mentioning to your own sister." "I knew what you'd say," Vittorio admitted. "You knew I'd say it's a risk we didn't need," Nora said. "We've spent 30 years keeping this family's business quiet, careful, beneath anyone's notice. One frightened husband with enough money for lawyers and investigators could undo decades of that carefulness in a matter of weeks." It was Elena herself, overhearing more of the conversation than either sibling realized through the thin office door, who finally stepped into the room rather than continue listening from the hallway, unwilling to remain a silent subject in a conversation about her own safety. "I can leave," Elena said, startling them both. "If my being here puts the family at risk, I won't stay and pretend that doesn't matter. I never wanted to be a burden to anyone." Nora studied her for a long moment, something in her expression softening slightly, despite the sharpness of her tone a moment earlier. "That's not what I said," she replied finally. "I said it's a risk. I didn't say it wasn't worth taking. I just wanted to be the one to decide that for myself, instead of finding out 3 weeks late from people who work in my own brother's kitchen." "You're deciding now," Vittorio said quietly. Nora was silent for a long moment, looking between her brother and the frightened, exhausted woman standing in front of her, with more dignity than her circumstances seemed to allow for. "My husband was not a kind man either," Nora said finally, the admission clearly costing her something. "A different kind of unkindness than what you're describing, maybe. But I remember what it felt like to need a door that would actually open." She uncrossed her arms. "Keep her safe, Vittorio. But keep this family safe while you're doing it. Those 2 things don't have to be in conflict, but you'll need to work harder than you have been to make sure they aren't." It was, in its own complicated way, the closest thing to a blessing the situation was likely to receive, and after Nora left, Vittorio remained quiet for a long while, turning her words over with the same careful seriousness he brought to every decision that mattered. "She's not wrong to worry," he said eventually. "I need you to know that I understand the cost of what I'm choosing here, Elena. I'm choosing it anyway." "Why?" Elena asked, the question quieter and more vulnerable than she intended. "Because some costs are worth paying," Vittorio said. "I decided that the night you knocked. Nothing since has changed my mind." She would think of that conversation often in the days that followed, because safety, it turned out, was a far more fragile thing than either of them had allowed themselves to believe. The trouble began with money, as trouble in places like Belmore Street so often did. A young man named Petey Dunlow worked the club's back entrance most evenings, a quiet job that mostly involved checking deliveries and keeping an eye on the alley. Petey was not a bad man, not by nature, but he carried a debt from a card game gone badly wrong, the kind of debt that made men desperate enough to consider choices they would never otherwise entertain. Edward Cole found him on a Tuesday evening, leaning against the alley wall during a break, and introduced himself as someone who could solve Petey's debt problem in exchange for a very small favor. I just need to know who comes and goes from that kitchen, Edward said, his tone reasonable, almost kind. Nothing that hurts anyone, just information. A worried husband wants to know his wife is safe. That's all this is. Petey hesitated. He had heard enough about Vittorio Conte to know that betraying anything connected to this building was not a small risk, debt or no debt. But the amount Edward offered was enough to clear what he owed twice over, and desperation has a way of making dangerous things sound reasonable. There's a woman, Petey admitted finally, his voice low. Came in maybe 2 weeks back. Stays upstairs above the kitchen. Nobody talks about her. I've only seen her twice, through the window when the curtain wasn't pulled all the way. It was enough. Edward Cole paid him, thanked him, and walked away with the final piece he needed. 2 nights later, Daniel Voss stood across the street from the club on Belmore Street for the first time. Dressed in clothes plain enough not to draw attention, watching the building with the patient, hungry focus of a man who believed he had finally found what belonged to him. He did not approach. Not yet. He had learned enough about the building's reputation over the past 2 weeks to understand that walking through that front door uninvited would be a mistake no amount of charm could undo. Instead, he watched, noting the comings and goings, the rhythm of the place, searching for the moment when its careful defenses might prove thinner than they appeared. On his second night of watching, a gust of wind caught the curtain in the second-floor window just enough to part it for the space of a single breath, and Daniel straightened against the lamppost, every muscle suddenly alert. A shape moved behind the glass, a woman's silhouette pausing near the window before the curtain fell back into place, and for one long, suspended moment, Daniel was certain, with the particular certainty of a man who has been waiting weeks for exactly this, that he was looking at his wife. He did not move. He did not cross the street. He simply watched the window for the rest of the night, long after the light behind it went dark, turning the brief glimpse over and over in his mind, until certainty hardened into something close to triumph. It was Sal who spotted him first, 3 nights into his careful surveillance, recognizing the particular stillness of a man pretending to wait for someone who was never coming. Sal had spent enough years watching this street to know every regular shape that belonged to it, and the man across from the club, leaning against a lamppost with a phone he never actually used, did not belong. He said nothing to Elena. He went straight to Vittorio instead. "We've got a problem," Sal said, closing the office door behind him. "Man's been watching the building 3 nights running. Same build, same coat, same spot across the street. He's not police. Police don't dress that carefully to blend in." Vittorio's expression hardened into something Elena had not yet seen, something closer to the reputation that had drawn her to this building in the first place. Description? Tall, dark hair, going gray at the sides, expensive coat trying hard to look ordinary. Sal's eyes narrowed, matches what little she's told us about her husband. Vittorio was silent for a long moment, his jaw working as he considered the problem from every angle a man in his position had learned to consider problems from. "Find out how he found us," he said finally. Someone talked. "I want to know who before this gets any worse." It did not take long. Sal had a particular skill for unraveling small lies, and Petey Dunlow had never been built for the kind of pressure that came from sitting across a table from a man like Sal Romano, with nowhere left to look but down at his own hands. "I didn't think it would hurt anyone," Petey said, his voice breaking somewhere in the middle of the sentence. He said it was just information. He said his wife wasn't well, that he was worried. "And you believed him," Sal said, not unkindly, though the disappointment in his voice cut deeper than anger would have. "You sold out someone hiding from a man you'd never even met, based on nothing but what that man told you about himself." Petey had no answer for that, because there wasn't one that would make the betrayal smaller than it was. When Vittorio learned the full extent of it, he did not raise his voice, which Elena would later understand was somehow more frightening than if he had. He simply made it clear, in a quiet, even tone, that Petey's debts were now the least of his problems, and that trust once broken inside these walls was not easily rebuilt. Petey left that night and did not return, and the matter was closed in whatever manner matters were closed in a building that operated mostly outside the reach of ordinary consequences. For Elena, the discovery landed like a physical blow. She had allowed herself, over 2 careful weeks, to believe in the solidity of the walls around her, and learning how easily a single desperate man had cracked them open, left her shaking in a way she had not been since the night she arrived. "He's outside," she said to Vittorio that evening, her voice barely above a whisper. Right now, across the street, he could be looking up at this window. He's not, Vittorio said firmly. Sal's had him watched since the moment we found him. He knows there's something here worth watching, but he doesn't know what, and he doesn't know enough to act on it yet. That's the difference between danger and disaster, Elena. We still have time. Time for what? Elena asked, and for the first time since arriving, real panic edged into her voice. He's not going to stop, Vittorio. I know him. He doesn't stop until he gets what he wants. And what he wants is me, back in that house, pretending none of this ever happened. Vittorio crossed the room and knelt in front of her chair so that they were level, his expression steady in a way that demanded she meet his eyes instead of looking away. He is not getting you back, he said, each word deliberate. Not while I'm standing between you and that door. I made you a promise the night you knocked, and I intend to keep it, whatever it costs. You don't owe me that, Elena said quietly. You barely know me. I know enough, Vittorio said. I know what it costs a person to knock on a door like mine in the middle of the night. I'm not in the business of letting that cost go to waste. It was not a declaration of anything beyond what it appeared to be, and yet something passed between them in that moment that neither was quite ready to name. A recognition that had been building quietly across 2 weeks of shared tea and careful conversation, now sharpened suddenly by the presence of real danger standing watch across the street. Outside, in the cooling night air, Daniel Voss finally abandoned his post for the evening, satisfied that he had learned enough to move to the next stage of his plan. He had confirmed the building's importance. He knew now that something inside it was being protected, with a level of care that went well beyond ordinary business. He did not yet know who lived behind that drawn curtain on the second floor, not with certainty, but instinct told him he was close, closer than he had been in 2 long weeks of searching. He walked back to his car, with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed, correctly or not, that patience always won in the end. Inside the club, the lights stayed on later than usual that night, voices low and serious behind the closed door of Vittorio's office, as a building that had weathered far worse threats than one careful husband began quietly preparing for whatever came next. Elena did not sleep again that night, not from fear alone but from the slow, uncomfortable understanding that the line between her old life and her new one had grown thinner than she wanted to admit, and that somewhere across the city, a man who had once promised to love her was now treating her absence like a puzzle he fully intended to solve. Daniel Voss did not return to Belmore Street the following night, nor the night after that, and for a few uneasy days it seemed possible the danger had simply drifted elsewhere. Elena allowed herself to hope, cautiously, that her husband had given up the search and turned his attention to rebuilding the story he would tell people about why his wife had left. Vittorio did not share her optimism. Men like that don't give up, he told her, on the 4th quiet evening. They change tactics. That worries me more than watching ever did. He was right to worry. Daniel had spent those 4 days not retreating but regrouping, sitting across a polished desk from a lawyer named Gerald Finch, a man with a reputation for finding legal solutions to problems other lawyers considered unsolvable. Gerald specialized in exactly the kind of careful, paper-built strategy Daniel now needed, one that required no confrontation at all, no need to set foot anywhere near a building he had learned, through careful inquiry, belonged to people far more dangerous than he was prepared to challenge directly. If she won't come home willingly, Gerald explained, steepling his fingers in a gesture that mirrored Vittorio's own without either man ever knowing it, then we make sure home is the only safe option left to her. Courts move slowly, Daniel, but they move predictably, and predictable is exactly what we want here. The plan Gerald built over the following week was, in its own quiet way, more dangerous than any threat Daniel could have made standing on a doorstep. It rested on a single, carefully constructed claim, that Elena Voss had a history of emotional instability, that she had vanished before under the influence of an undiagnosed condition, and that her husband, far from being a danger to her, was the only person capable of ensuring her safety while she received the treatment she desperately needed. Gerald drafted statements from a doctor willing to overlook the thinness of his actual knowledge of Elena's medical history in exchange for a generous consulting fee. He drafted a petition for emergency guardianship, the kind of document designed to move through a sympathetic judge's chambers quickly, before anyone on the other side had time to properly respond. It was, Daniel understood with something close to satisfaction, A plan that required no violence, no confrontation, nothing that could ever be traced back to him as anything other than the desperate actions of a worried husband. It also required, crucially, knowing exactly where Elena was, so that the legal machinery, once set in motion, could be aimed precisely. The final piece came from Edward Cole, who confirmed through patient, careful surveillance what Daniel had already begun to suspect. The woman behind the second-floor curtain on Belmore Street left the building exactly once in 3 weeks, briefly, to walk with another woman to a corner market 2 streets away before returning immediately. Edward photographed her from a distance too great for certainty, but close enough for confidence. He delivered the photograph to Daniel without comment, and Daniel studied it for a long time in the privacy of his office, feeling something settle into place that was neither love nor grief, but a colder, more practical kind of certainty. He had found her. The court papers were filed on a Thursday morning, and the hearing was set for the following Tuesday, a timeline Gerald had engineered specifically to leave Elena's side as little room to prepare a response as possible. Notice of the proceeding, along with a formal letter from Gerald Finch's office, arrived at the only address connected to Elena that the court records still held, her sister's house, on Friday afternoon. Elena's sister called the club's private line within the hour, her voice tight with a fear that had nothing to do with curtains or watching strangers, and everything to do with paper and signatures and judges who had never met either of them. "He's saying you're unstable," her sister said, reading from the letter with a shaking voice. "He's saying he wants emergency guardianship, Elena. He's saying you need treatment you've been refusing to get. There's a hearing, Tuesday. If you don't show up, or if you show up and they believe him." She did not need to finish the sentence. Elena understood exactly what it meant if a judge believed Daniel's careful story. It meant losing the right to make decisions about her own life. It meant being legally returned to a house she had risked everything to escape, this time with the law itself standing behind the locked door instead of against it. She brought the news to Vittorio that evening, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone on which her sister had read the letter aloud a second time. Vittorio listened in silence, his expression darkening with each new detail, until finally he set down the pen he had been holding and looked at her with an intensity she had not seen from him before. "This is worse than I expected," he admitted. "I prepared for a man who might come through that door with anger. I did not prepare for a man clever enough to come through a courtroom instead." "What do we do?" Elena asked, her voice small in a way she hated. "I can't fight him in a courtroom, Vittorio. He has lawyers. He has money. He has a doctor saying things about me that aren't even true." For a long moment, Vittorio said nothing, staring at the closed door of his office as though the answer might be written on the other side of it. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a different kind of certainty than the protective promises he had made on quieter nights. "You're right that we can't fight him the way he expects to be fought," Vittorio said slowly. "He's built his whole plan around being seen as the reasonable one, the victim, the worried husband cleaning up after his unstable wife. If I show up at that courtroom looking like exactly what people already whisper that I am, it confirms every word he's going to say about the kind of company you've been keeping." "Then what?" Elena pressed. "Then we make sure the judge, and everyone else in that room, sees Daniel Voss clearly for the first time," Vittorio said. "Not as the man he's built himself to look like, as the man he actually is." It was Grace Bennett, quiet and precise with numbers, in a way that had nothing to do with the club's louder reputation, who first suggested where to look. She had overheard enough, in her years keeping the club's books, to know that men who controlled every detail of a marriage often controlled finances the same way, and that financial control left a trail far harder to erase than memory or testimony. "If he's as careful as Elena says," Grace said, laying out her reasoning at the small table in Vittorio's office, "then somewhere in his accounts, there's a gap between what he says he earns and what he actually spends. Men like that always think they've covered every angle. They rarely have." It took 3 days of careful, mostly quiet work. Grace sat up at the small table in Vittorio's office, with stacks of public filings, old invoices Elena remembered signing without ever questioning, and printouts a retired accountant named Felix Okafor, who had once owed Vittorio's father a debt he had spent decades trying to repay, brought over folded inside a grocery bag so as not to draw attention on the street. Felix had spent 30 years auditing exactly the kind of companies Daniel's investment fund resembled on paper, and he moved through the documents with the patient, unhurried thoroughness of a man who had long ago stopped being surprised by what careful people tried to hide. "Here," Felix said, on the second evening, tapping a line of figures with the end of his pen. "Quarterly distributions to clients that don't match the fund's actual returns for that period. Not by a little, by enough that somebody had to be moving real money to cover the difference, and moving it from somewhere it wasn't supposed to come from." Grace traced the gap backward through 18 months of statements, cross-referencing dates and account numbers late into the night, while Marco kept the coffee coming and Elena, unable to sleep, sat quietly in the corner, watching numbers slowly assemble themselves into the shape of a truth she had never been allowed to see clearly, while she still lived inside it. By the third night, the pattern Felix had first noticed had widened into something undeniable, a careful, patient theft stretched across nearly 4 years, hidden behind shell accounts and a business partnership that existed mostly on paper, money diverted from a private investment fund Daniel managed for a small group of trusting clients, quietly disappearing into accounts that led, eventually and unmistakably, straight back to him. It was, Vittorio realized as the picture became clear, not merely a private cruelty hidden behind a respectable career. It was a crime, the kind that interested people far more powerful than a single quiet investigator working out of a back office. "This isn't enough on its own," Vittorio said, studying the documents Grace and Felix had assembled. "Money trails like this take months to prove in court, sometimes years. We don't have months. We have until Tuesday." It was here that Vittorio reached out to someone outside the usual circle of favors and debts that ran through Belmore Street, a journalist named Henry Lockwood who had spent 15 years investigating financial corruption for a major city paper, and who Vittorio had quietly helped years earlier, when a different story had put Henry's own safety at risk. Henry owed Vittorio a debt of his own, the kind that had nothing to do with money. "I need this story out before Tuesday morning," Vittorio told him, laying the documents across Henry's kitchen table late on Sunday night. "Not buried in a financial section 3 weeks from now, out, loud, and impossible to ignore." Henry studied the papers carefully, his journalist's instincts sharpening as he traced the pattern Grace had uncovered. "If this checks out the way it looks like it does, I don't need much persuading," he said, "but I need to verify it myself before I publish a word. I'm not running a story on your word alone, even yours. That's exactly what I'd expect from a man worth trusting," Vittorio said. Henry worked through Sunday night and most of Monday, cross-referencing the documents against public filings, contacting 2 of Daniel's former investment clients under careful pretense, confirming piece by piece that the pattern was real, that money meant for retirement accounts and college funds had been quietly redirected for years into accounts controlled entirely by Daniel Voss. By Monday evening, Henry had more than enough for a story that would do exactly what Vittorio had asked of it. The article appeared online at 6 o'clock Tuesday morning, hours before the scheduled hearing, under a headline that left no room for ambiguity about the seriousness of its claims. By 7, it had been picked up by 2 larger outlets. By 8, reporters were calling Daniel's office for comment, and Gerald Finch was calling Daniel's private line, with a voice considerably less confident than it had carried the week before. "This changes everything," Gerald said, his composure cracking for the first time since Daniel had hired him. "We cannot walk into a guardianship hearing this morning with your name trending across every financial news outlet in the city. A judge isn't going to grant guardianship to a man being investigated for fraud. We need to postpone." "Postpone to when?" Daniel demanded, his careful calm finally beginning to fracture under the weight of a problem he had not built any contingency for. "This was supposed to be simple, Gerald. This was supposed to be paperwork." "It was simple," Gerald said, "until somebody decided to make it considerably less so." Daniel arrived at the courthouse anyway, less out of strategy than out of a refusal to believe the morning's events could truly undo weeks of careful planning. He found, instead of the quiet, controlled hearing he had expected, a hallway crowded with reporters who had read Henry Lockwood's article and recognized an opportunity when they saw one. Questions came at him from every direction, sharp and unrelenting, about diverted client funds, about shell accounts, about whether his sudden interest in his wife's mental health had perhaps less to do with concern and more to do with controlling a witness who might one day have reason to speak about more than just their marriage. Daniel said nothing to any of them, his face cycling rapidly through expressions he had never needed to manage in public before, settling finally on a tight, controlled blankness that fooled no one watching. Inside the courtroom, the judge, who had been expected to hear a quiet, uncontested guardianship petition, instead found herself reviewing a case that had exploded into public scrutiny overnight, with a petitioner whose own financial conduct was now the subject of multiple ongoing inquiries. The hearing, when it finally began nearly 2 hours late, lasted only minutes. The judge dismissed the emergency guardianship petition outright, citing both insufficient medical evidence and what she described, with visible disapproval, as serious and credible concerns about the petitioner's own conduct and motives. Daniel Voss left the courthouse that afternoon through a side entrance, avoiding the cameras that had multiplied steadily throughout the morning, his careful plan not merely defeated, but transformed into the very kind of public exposure he had spent his entire adult life working to avoid. In the apartment above the kitchen on Belmore Street, Elena watched the news coverage unfold on a small television Marco had carried up that morning, her hands pressed tightly together in her lap, as headline after headline confirmed what Vittorio had promised her 3 days earlier. Her husband had not been defeated by anger, or by threat, or by anything resembling the violence she had spent years quietly afraid of. He had been defeated by daylight, by careful work done patiently and without a single raised voice, in a manner so thorough that there would be no quiet recovery from it. When Vittorio appeared in the doorway that evening, Elena rose from her chair before he had even finished crossing the threshold, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, the silence between them carrying more relief and more unspoken feeling than either was yet prepared to put into words. "It's not over," Vittorio said finally, gently, unwilling to let her believe the danger had vanished entirely, even as he allowed himself a small, genuine smile. "There will be investigations now, lawyers, consequences that take time to fully settle, but he can't come for you through a courtroom anymore, Elena. Not after this. You did this for me," Elena said quietly. "All of it. I did it because it was the right thing to do," Vittorio said, "and because, somewhere along the way, you stopped being a stranger who knocked on my door, and became someone whose safety mattered to me more than I expected it to." Outside, across the city, the article continued to spread, reaching desks and screens and breakfast tables far beyond Belmore Street, dismantling in a single morning a life Daniel Voss had spent years carefully constructing, while inside a small apartment above a quiet kitchen, two people who had been strangers 3 weeks earlier stood close enough to finally admit, without quite saying so aloud, that something important had changed between them. A few days later, once the immediate danger of the guardianship hearing had passed, Vittorio brought a visitor up the back stairs that Elena had not been expecting. Margaret Whitfield was a small, precise woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and a manner that put Elena instantly at ease, the kind of careful warmth that came from years spent guiding frightened people through frightening situations. "Mr. Conti tells me you've had quite a month," Margaret said, settling into the chair across from Elena with a folder already open on her lap. "I want to be very clear about something before we start. I don't work for him. I work for you. Whatever you decide about the divorce, about any of it, that decision belongs to you alone." "I don't even know where to begin," Elena admitted. "That's exactly why I'm here," Margaret said. "You don't have to know. You just have to tell me the truth, in your own time, and let me handle the parts that require knowing the law instead of knowing your own life." It was, Elena would realize later, the first time since the night she had knocked on a heavy wooden door that someone had spoken to her not as a problem to be managed or a danger to be contained, but simply as a client, an adult, a woman entitled to make her own careful decisions about her own future. She found herself, for the first time in weeks, looking forward to a conversation that had nothing to do with hiding at all. The weeks that followed moved at a pace entirely different from the careful, narrow rhythm Elena had grown used to inside the apartment above the kitchen. Henry Lockwood's article had opened a door that investigators were only too willing to walk through, and within days, formal inquiries into Daniel Voss's investment fund had expanded far beyond the original handful of irregularities Grace had first uncovered. Clients who had trusted him for years came forward, one after another, describing retirement accounts that had quietly shrunk over time, college funds that no longer matched the statements they had been shown, a pattern of careful, deliberate theft stretched across nearly half a decade. Daniel hired new lawyers, Men more accustomed to defending against criminal charges than drafting guardianship petitions. But even the most skilled defense could not undo the simple, damning clarity of the financial trail Grace's work had set in motion. Within a month, formal charges were filed. Within 2, Daniel Voss stood before a different judge entirely, in a courtroom considerably less interested in his concerned husband performance than the one he had walked into weeks earlier with such confidence. Elena did not attend that hearing. She had been advised, gently but firmly, by a lawyer Vittorio had arranged on her behalf, a careful, soft-spoken woman named Margaret Whitfield, who specialized in exactly the kind of situation Elena had found herself in, that her presence was neither required nor particularly wise. Instead, Elena waited at the club, in the small office that had become as familiar to her now as any room in any house she had ever lived in, while Margaret called with updates throughout the day. "He's pleading guilty to 2 of the 4 charges," Margaret reported that evening, her voice carrying the careful satisfaction of someone delivering good news without wanting to seem as though she were celebrating another person's downfall too openly. "It's a deal, but it's a real one, Elena. Significant time, restitution to his clients. And it puts a formal end to any claim he might have tried to make about your stability or your fitness to make your own decisions. That part of this is finished." Elena sat with the phone pressed to her ear for a long moment after Margaret finished speaking, trying to locate the feeling she had expected to arrive with news like this. Relief came, eventually, but slower and quieter than she had imagined, mixed with something closer to exhaustion than triumph. 6 years of careful fear did not dissolve the moment a courtroom finally agreed with what she had always known to be true. It simply began, finally, to lift. The divorce proceedings that followed were almost anticlimactic by comparison, a formality settled quickly given the criminal case already underway, and within 4 months of the night Elena had knocked on a door she had never expected to answer. She found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, legally and entirely her own person. She marked the day quietly, alone at first, sitting on the back landing where she had once been permitted nothing more than careful, restricted air, watching the late afternoon light fall across the narrow alley below. It was Marco who found her there, balancing 2 cups of tea he had clearly made himself, given how unevenly the milk had been stirred into each. "Grace said you'd want company," Marco said, settling onto the step beside her, without waiting for an invitation. "She also said not to ask you any questions about feelings, because apparently that's not how this works, so I'm not asking. I'm just sitting here." Elena laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came easily now in a way it had not when she first arrived. "You're terrible at not asking questions, Marco." "I know," Marco admitted, "but I'm excellent at making tea badly enough that nobody wants to talk about anything else." It was, in its small, unremarkable way, exactly the kind of moment Elena had not allowed herself to imagine during the long, careful weeks of hiding. Ordinary, safe, entirely her own. Sal Romano's change of heart, when it finally came, arrived without fanfare, in the manner most true changes of heart arrive, quietly and through accumulated evidence rather than any single dramatic moment. He had watched Elena, over those months, work alongside Grace with growing skill, had watched her face down a courtroom battle she had never asked for, with more steadiness than most people in his experience managed under far less pressure, had watched Vittorio's evening visits to the small apartment above the kitchen stretch longer and grow gentler with each passing week. It was Sal himself who finally said something to Vittorio, nearly 5 months after that first uneasy night, the 2 of them standing in the quiet of the closed club after the staff had gone home. "I was wrong about her," Sal said, with the particular bluntness of a man who did not enjoy admitting fault, but valued honesty enough to do it anyway. "I thought she was a liability the day she walked in here. Turns out she's steadier than half the men who've worked under this roof for a decade. I could have told you that the first night," Vittorio said. "You could have," Sal agreed. "Wouldn't have believed you, though. Some things a person has to see for themselves." It was around this same time that Elena began to seriously consider what her life might look like beyond the careful walls of Belmore Street, now that those walls no longer needed to function as a hiding place. Her sister offered, more than once, to help her find an apartment of her own, somewhere with windows that did not require careful management, a life rebuilt entirely separate from everything connected to the months of hiding that had come before. Her sister visited in person not long after the divorce was finalized, the first time she had ever set foot inside the club, standing a little stiffly in the kitchen doorway, in a coat that looked out of place among the flour-dusted counters and simmering pots. Grace welcomed her warmly. Marco offered her tea with his usual uneven pour, and slowly, over the course of an afternoon, Elena watched her sister's careful wariness soften into something closer to understanding. "I pictured something different," her sister admitted quietly, once they were alone for a moment on the back landing. "Darker, colder. I don't know what I expected, honestly. Somewhere that matched the stories people tell about this street. It surprised me too at first," Elena said. "I should have come for you sooner," her sister said, the guilt she had clearly been carrying for months finally surfacing. "Before any of this, I knew things weren't right with Daniel. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. You came when I needed you to read me a letter over the phone with your hands shaking as badly as mine," Elena said gently. "That counts for more than you're giving yourself credit for. I'm here. I'm safe. That's what matters now." Her sister hugged her then, the first real, unguarded embrace either of them had managed in longer than either cared to admit, and when she finally left that evening, she did so with a promise to visit again soon, a promise she would, in the months that followed, keep more often than either of them expected. Elena considered her sister's offer of a new apartment seriously each time it was made, and each time, she found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, less and less drawn to the idea. "I keep waiting to want to leave," she admitted to Vittorio one evening, the two of them sitting in the small office that had once felt foreign and now felt simply like a place she belonged. "Everyone assumes I will. My sister keeps sending me listings, but every time I imagine it, some apartment somewhere with a view of a street I don't know, it doesn't feel like freedom. It just feels like a different kind of empty." Vittorio was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with the same careful deliberation he brought to every serious conversation between them. "You don't have to stay here out of obligation," he said finally. "Whatever this place gave you, you don't owe it your future in return." "I know that," Elena said. "That's not why I'm considering staying." She met his eyes directly, something she had grown more comfortable doing over the months since that first frightened night. "I'm considering staying because somewhere in the middle of all of this place stopped being a hiding spot and started being somewhere I actually want to wake up in, and you stopped being the man who answered the door and started being someone I genuinely don't want to walk away from." The silence that followed carried none of the careful distance that had once defined every conversation between them. Vittorio studied her for a long moment, something unguarded crossing his expression for perhaps the first time since the night they had met. "I made you a promise once," he said quietly, "that nobody touches anyone under this roof without going through me first. I think, somewhere along the way, that promise became something a great deal more personal than I intended it to be." "Is that a problem?" Elena asked, a small, hopeful smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. "No," Vittorio said. "It's the first thing in a long time that hasn't felt like one." They did not rush what followed. Both of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, that whatever was building between them deserved more care than the speed of their circumstances might have otherwise demanded. Elena spent the following weeks slowly, deliberately, reclaiming pieces of a life she had once been too frightened to imagine for herself, taking on more responsibility alongside Grace, in managing the club's legitimate accounts, reconnecting carefully with friends Daniel had once made too costly to keep, rebuilding, piece by careful piece, an identity that belonged entirely to her. It was nearly 6 months after that first desperate knock on a heavy wooden door that Elena finally unpacked the small bag she had carried with her that rainy night, the same bag that had sat, mostly untouched, in the corner of the apartment above the kitchen for the better part of half a year. She had kept it packed without quite admitting to herself why, some small, cautious part of her still half expecting the need to run again at any moment. That evening, with the late spring light falling warm and steady through windows she no longer needed to keep carefully curtained, Elena finally opened the bag fully, lifting out the few items she had grabbed in that desperate rush of midnight panic, and began, one by one, placing them into drawers she now understood, with quiet and complete certainty, were entirely her own to keep. A folded sweater, soft from years of wear, into the top drawer of the small dresser Marco had helped her carry up from storage the week before. A worn paperback book, its spine cracked from rereading, onto the narrow shelf beside the bed. A single photograph of her mother, the only thing from her old life she had been unable to leave behind that first night, set carefully on the windowsill where morning light would reach it. Beside it, she set a small clipping of basil, cut fresh that morning from the chipped wooden box on the back landing, its sharp green smell filling the small room with something that felt, more than anything else she owned, entirely alive. When the bag was finally, completely empty, Elena folded it small and set it on the top shelf of the closet, not because she expected to need it again, but because some part of her wanted to keep it, a quiet reminder of exactly how far she had come from the woman who had run barefoot through the rain, with nothing but fear and a half-packed bag to her name. Vittorio found her there a short while later, standing in the doorway with the particular contentment of a man watching someone finish building something important. "Settling in for good, then," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Settling in for good," Elena confirmed, closing the closet door and turning to face him fully, the late light catching warm across the small, ordinary room that had become, through nothing more dramatic than time and careful kindness, the first place in longer than she could remember that had ever truly felt like home. Outside, the city moved on the way cities always do, indifferent to the quiet victories taking shape inside any one of its countless buildings. Daniel Voss served his sentence in a facility 2 states away, his name occasionally surfacing in financial news articles, as a cautionary example, rather than a cautionary tale anyone felt much sympathy toward. Edward Cole found other clients, other small betrayals to chase for a fee, the particulars of Elena Voss fading quickly from his memory, the way most jobs eventually did. Gerald Finch took on new clients of his own, more careful now about which kinds of certainty he was willing to put his name behind. And on Belmore Street, behind a heavy wooden door with a brass lion's head knocker that strangers still occasionally hesitated before approaching, life continued in its careful, steady rhythm, a kitchen that never stopped smelling faintly of coffee and bread, a young man named Marco slowly growing into responsibilities he would one day be ready to carry fully, a sharp-eyed second-in-command who had learned, eventually, to trust his own instincts a little less, and the people around him a little more. And upstairs, in a small apartment that had once been nothing more than a hiding place, a woman who had arrived with nothing but a half-packed bag and a desperate hope that somewhere in this city a door might finally open instead of close, built a life entirely her own, one ordinary, unhurried day at a time. She had come to that door in the middle of the night, certain only that she was running from something. She stayed, in the end, because somewhere along the way, without either of them planning it, she had found something worth running toward instead.